as promised, stitching. So with stitching, it's actually pretty simple but very repetitive and tedious process. What you're going to want to get are basically some stitching needles, and just kind of look like your standard kind of sewing needle. You know, they've got an eyelet on one side, but they're blunt on this end. It's just a slightly sharp end, but it's more blunt than, say, like a sewing needle would be. And you're going to take your thread, put it through the end like you normally would. The difference is you're not going to tie anything off. We're just going to lay it down flat like that. So this is a white wax thread. I've got the packaging right here. This is wax braided cord, white. I wanted to go for some contrast stitching in this, just because I think it looks super cool. Okay, so if we switch over here, you'll see I've got my strap here set up on a stitching pony. You can see just the top half, but it's essentially, you know, this clamp up here. I've got a little wing nut that lets me tighten it. And normally you sit on these. There's a little bar that would go between my legs, and I sit down, and it puts them, you know, about chest height so I can work on the piece. But for showing everybody here what's going on, I'm not doing it that way. So this actually is going to be kind of a little awkward for me because I'm working kind of backwards so you guys can see what's going on. So we've got our holes, right, that we've already put into the leather. So we can just start. We're just going to put it through like so. So you might be wondering, well, how much thread should I use? The general rule of thumb, I'm sorry, my arm's in the way there, I've heard is about 7 times the length of your project. And that may just be for lacing, not necessarily for thread, but I've kind of used that general idea. I kind of look at the size of it and just kind of guesstimate from there. So we're going to be doing this kind of double stitch here, where I'll be coming in through the back here. So I've got that going through, but then I'm going to stick my other needle through the same hole. And this can get a little difficult. There we go. And now I've got both of my needles through that hole. And we just pull them on out. So I also have a pair of needle nose pliers for this process, just to kind of help me get that through. And there we go. Just keep pulling. And we've laid in our first stitch. Give it a little tug. You're not going to manhandle it. You're not going to pull too tight, because that can actually start to cut into the leather. And depending on the type of leather, you could actually cut through it. But just want to make sure it's good and snug in there. And then we just move on to the next hole. Now, if your holes aren't wide enough, if it's kind of hard to get things through, you can use your stylus here and just use the pointed end, kind of put it through the hole, widen it back out, and that'll give you what you need to get this stuff pulled through. Again, my needle nose pliers. Ooh. But you can see how if I was sitting on the stitching pony, how much easier it would be to just kind of go straight through. I mean, and that's it. That's essentially all we're going to do. We're going to take this all the way to the end, to that last hole. And then what I'll end up doing is I'll work back a couple of stitches and I'll show you what that's going to look like. So I'll go ahead and do this single line, and I'll show you how I finish it off. Just to make it a little bit easier, I pull that off. So all we're going to end up doing is walking this back a couple of stitches. One thing I did want to point out, when we're doing this, we want to make sure that we put, you know, the needle through. I don't want to then pull this one through and then put the other needle through. I want to keep that needle in there and then feed the other needle in. The reason being is you can actually end up cutting your thread or going through your thread. If you put one through, pull it all the way through, leave the thread there, well, that needle can actually unbind or unwind the cord, and you can end up getting snags and all sorts of stuff. So you want to keep that needle in and then put your other one through. Well, of course, now we've got this situation where this is a pretty tight sequence, so I'm probably going to have to go through where, like we talked about earlier, and just work my stylus into that area just to open up the hole a bit to make this section easier. And I'm only going to walk it back probably just two holes here. Again, this is where these pliers come in real handy. Sometimes another thing to watch out for is not getting basically a bow tie where you end up getting the, you know, there's going to be a loop on one side and the needle goes through that loop. You're going to kind of create a little bowing effect, if you know what I mean. All right, so since I'm only going to go back two, I'm going to widen this hole up here. I'm only going to this time feed my needle just the front one to the back. So now I've got both needles sitting in the back here. I'll pull out those needles. So now I've just got the thread. And I'm going to tie this off like so. And then just take some clippers, clip it off. And then the fun part, like we all love to do, is we get to play with some fire. So one thing you can try to do is just turn your flame on. Sometimes you can just let this kind of heat up the metal. We'll see if this is going to work for us. It doesn't always work. But you're essentially trying to burn off these edges. It didn't quite work for us. So I'm just going to essentially just lightly go over that area. And since it's wax, that wax is going to burn, right? And seal this off for us. You don't have to put the, you know, flame directly on it. You just have to kind of get it to melt. And then I'm going to take my handy dandy little mallet here, and I'm just going to pound the threads, and just to kind of, I know you can't see this, but trust me, I'm just using this poly mallet. Since it's plastic flat, it's not going to mar the leather, it's not going to mess with the thread itself. I'm just flattening out the threads. And that was it. So there we go. We've got this whole thing threaded through. We'll do this backside. Now this whole section here is actually going to be glued onto the belt itself, just like we did the suede backing. We're going to glue these sections on, both this and the buckle portion. And then once the glue sets overnight, we'll come back through and I'll put the holes, match these holes back up and drive it through all pieces of leather and then sew everything in. For this particular piece, I'm trying to do fewer rivets. I'm trying to do more sewing, just to kind of make sure that this is going to last a really long time. Sometimes pop rivets, they have a short lifespan. They can pop after a time, and sewing is basically going to be the surefire way to get the most out of your piece and the longest life out of it. So I'm just going to go through, get all this stuff sewn in, glue this down, and then when we come back, we'll be getting our hardware set in, and that would pretty much be the end of this. Before we do that, I always forget a step. We're going to want to do our edge paint. So when we come back, that's probably what we end up doing, is doing our edge paints. All right, see you then.